everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong, and this video is Red, White, and Royal Blue, A Historian's Analysis, Part 3, You Still Haven't Noticed My Tie, the visual and symbolic language of Red, White, and Royal Blue. So if you've been watching this series already, you'll know that I posted an introduction in which I sort of explained and laid out my reasons for why I'm doing this extremely detailed, exhaustive analysis of this movie. And I also posted parts 1 and 2. Part 1 on the historical context of Red, White, and Royal Blue, the historical allusions, the resonances with American and British history, royal history, gay history. And then part 2 on the romance, and I looked at the personalities and the behaviors of Alex and Henry and how they are attracted to one another. And I argued that these two characters function both as effective symbols of their two countries, but also at the same time as convincing three-dimensional real people. And now I want to talk about something that I alluded to back in the introduction, where I said that there is a complicated language of images and symbols that appear on screen in this movie, and that add a whole complex further layer of meaning into this story that you might only barely notice or maybe completely overlook the first time you watch it, but that can become clear with careful examination. And I argued in that introduction that there's one particular shot that I think serves as kind of the establishing shot of the entire movie, and that introduces a whole complex of themes and motifs that then reappear and are woven through all the rest of the film. And it's this shot in which we see Alex holding a drink next to a huge wall mirror. So we see in this shot the figure of Alex standing off to the side of the ballroom, his posture ramrod straight, chest puffed out, clearly trying to project confidence, but he's clutching his glass of scotch, and on his face is this sort of stony expression. All around him are looming these massive architectural forms, right? The ballroom with these rich scarlet walls and these towering fluted pillars. And then, of course, on the wall behind Alex, over his right shoulder, we see the mirror and his own back reflected in it, and then beyond that, the scene of the wedding reception that he's watching, the figures that he's clearly looking at, with Henry right there in the center. And as I argued in the introduction, this sort of sets us up to see through Alex's eyes, to follow and experience Alex's fascination and obsession with Henry as he serves as almost a kind of detective discovering Henry. Now, this shot is echoed a number of times later in the movie. The imagery, the colors, the composition. In the beginning of the Red Room scene in the White House. This is possibly my favorite shot in the whole movie, where Alex has been anxious, waiting. He doesn't know why Henry hasn't been talking to him, has been avoiding him. And he's there waiting in the Red Room, and this is what we see just as Henry walks in. We see this shot of Alex once again watching and observing Henry, and the background is much like in the ballroom scene with the rich scarlet red walls, and behind him is this pleated amber-colored lampshade which echoes the fluted gold pillars in the ballroom. And moreover, Alex's pose and body language are very similar, with the same sort of puffed chest, but his facial expression is totally different. He's not closed and stony like in the Buckingham ballroom scene, but now his face is open, expectant, hopeful, and this shows his emotional change through the first act of the movie, and his transformation in his perception of Henry, which mirrors Henry's gradual opening of his facade to Alex. And also in this Red Room shot, instead of being literally mirrored by his own reflection, like we saw in Buckingham Palace, instead now the figure of Alex is mirrored by that of Alexander Hamilton, facing him. So this is the historical figure that Alex is named after, and we see the figure of Alexander Hamilton doubling our Alex with similar dress and the same pose with the chest puffed out. And it alludes to Alex's aspirations, his ambition, the enormous legacy that he wants to live up to. And you could see Hamilton here as the kind of imaginary, idealized self-image image that Alex wants to attain. Now, both of these scenes that I've been talking about, but especially that first grounding shot in Buckingham Palace, it is reminiscent of Vertigo, as I said before in the introduction too. The scarlet red walls of the ballroom recall the luxurious high-end restaurant in San Francisco where we first see the character of Madeline, the woman that the main character of Vertigo becomes obsessed with, as Alex becomes obsessed with Henry. And there are a lot of interesting parallels and counterpoints between this movie and Vertigo. So just to give a very short synopsis of the plot of Vertigo, an aging detective named Scotty, played by Jimmy Stewart, is hired to track the movements and activities of a wealthy society matron named Madeline. And in his investigation, he finds that she is living a sort of double life and has adopted a false second persona using the name of her own supposed ancestor, Carlotta Valdez. But in the course of his investigation, Scotty becomes romantically entangled with Madeline, very much against professional ethics. And he finds that she is mentally unwell, unstable. She dies by an apparent suicide. But Scotty is uncertain about the reality of Madeline's death. He suspects possible fakery. And later he runs into an ordinary working-class woman in San Francisco named Judy, who, although she dresses very differently, behaves, speaks differently from Madeline, she looks uncannily like the supposedly dead woman. And Scotty asks her out and begins an affair with Judy, but then he pressures her to dress and style her hair like Madeline, and he begins to seem more and more obsessive and controlling towards Judy, to the point of seeming menacing and possibly dangerous. At the same time that we see Judy transform and begin to resemble Madeline so much that we in the audience must suspect that Scotty may be right and that in fact they are the same person. Perhaps there was no Madeline, or her death was faked and Judy is her. So the whole movie of Vertigo can be seen as a metaphor and a meditation on obsessive and destructive love, showing how erotic attraction thrives on mystery and the impossibility of ever really knowing someone completely, knowing their past, their mind, their psyche. And it dramatizes how the insistence on possessing a person, knowing everything about them, and keeping them precisely as they were when you first met them, is always self-defeating and bound to fail. It is impossible to reduce a complex, evolving person to a single figure frozen in time. And hence you could say this sort of obsessive love is not true love or is not sustainable. And the movie also plays all along with the theme of doubling, as all the characters here have multiple identities, hidden motives, and pasts. They're split between public and private personae, and between the real and the illusory, the present and the past. And this is shown in Vertigo, especially through shots with mirrors. And that then is echoed in Red, White, and Royal Blue. So Alex becomes similarly obsessed with Henry as he discovers the private self, the private Henry, Henry Fox, underneath the public persona. And I've already discussed that in parts 1 and 2, the sort of double Henry, right? The public, the Prince Henry that belongs to Britain, and the private Henry Fox. So Alex, you could say, sort of plays the role of the detective, Scotty, and he is similarly drawn in to the sort of web of mystery around Henry. But this story, of course, has a very different ending. Vertigo, I won't give too much away, but it does not turn out well. Well, Red, White, and Royal Blue turns out very differently, and I would say these characters end up forming a strong, loving bond because Alex does accept the essential mystery of Henry. He doesn't try to possess Henry by knowing everything about him. And this reality is made most explicit in the book. Like many things I've talked about, it's alluded to or suggested in the movie. It's explicit in the book. So in the novel, Alex goes to Kensington Palace after they have been outed and their emails have been exposed. And he sees that Henry is unhappy, devastated, sort of enervated. And he asks his sister, Bea, what is going on and what this means about Henry. And Bea describes Henry's recurring unresolved grief and depression. And she says to Alex, quote, "There is a sadness and a hurt in him that is tremendous, and you may very well never truly understand it." And Alex does not take this as an obstacle. Rather, he embraces it, and he says, quote, "I've always felt in him there's this side of him that's unknowable. But that's the choice. I love him with all that because of all that," end quote. So Alex accepts Henry's essentially elusive and mysterious character. But in the movie, we see that this creates crises and complications for Alex, and this is conveyed through the visual language of the film. So in the first act of the movie, starting at least as early as the phone call scene, it's made clear that Henry has this double persona and a kind of double personality. And this is then made explicit in Paris, right, with the distinction between the two Henrys. By contrast, Alex seems to be more straightforward. He's open and expressive, instinctively informal. He has little to hide. But this begins to change with his attraction to Henry, which awakens sexual and romantic feelings that are at odds with his self-image and his public image. And this tension intensifies as he at once becomes more deeply involved with Henry and more involved in the political campaign. And this leads to a sort of split into public and private personae, into sort of two Alexes, like the two Henrys. And as in Vertigo, this split is represented through mirrors. So mirrors become the most important recurring motif associated with Alex. His association with mirrors starts firstly in that shot in Buckingham Palace, and then it comes back again a bit later in the texting correspondence between Alex and Henry. So when Alex makes sexual jokes, we see him reflected in the mirror in his room in the White House, as if his interactions with Henry are causing him to create or construct a new version of himself. Then the motif becomes most dramatic and obvious in the second act, near the middle of the film, when we see a montage of Alex's activities in Texas. So we're seeing him taking on this more public and political role, while on the soundtrack, we're hearing his correspondence with Henry, which is very intimate and private. The sort of split between these two aspects opens up just between the visual and the sound that we're hearing at the same time. And mirrors start appearing, such as in the hotel hallway when Alex takes a selfie with a hotel maid. So now he's being photographed as a public figure. And it underscores again how Alex is constructing an image for the public which obscures his private doubts and turmoil. Then in a hotel room, presumably somewhere in Texas, we're given another shot that closely mimics the composition of that shot in Buckingham Palace Ballroom. So in this one, Alex is in bed, so it's very private, it's an intimate space, but he's intently watching Henry, in this case on a television screen. Over his right shoulder, just as in the Buckingham Palace scene, there's a mirror, and in the mirror we see the figure of Henry that Alex is watching. So this shot is then followed by a rapid concatenation of mirrors. So immediately after it, we see Alex in the bathroom rehearsing a speech, right, preparing himself for a public appearance, and he's watching himself in the mirror. And notably in this shot, the reflection of Alex is actually bigger and more prominent than the man himself. Then immediately after that, we see him exercising in the gym. So again, taking care of his appearance, his looks. And this time we see an entire wall of mirrors in which we see Alex running on the treadmill, and then also, once more, we see a television screen reflected. And in this case, it's not Henry, but his mother that is sort of looming over his shoulder, you could say. And it's during this scene that we see Alex confess to what Henry calls his imposter syndrome, right? This fear that his public self is overtaking the reality of who he really is. His public image is becoming overinflated. And as he's saying this, the camera actually zooms in and his reflection grows larger to the point that it overtakes the actual figure of Alex. So this visually dramatizes the sort of the public Alex, the constructed Alex, threatening to completely overshadow the private person. And then immediately after that, we see Alex out there actually in public talking to a crowd. And here we don't see any literal mirrors, but it's interesting that in this brick wall behind him and sort of looming above him is this row of reflective mirrory windows. So there's, again, this allusion to the mirror. Then the next time that mirrors appear is in the New York hotel room, where Alex sleeps with Henry in secret, but then Zara barges in and discovers their affair. So this is the first point, you could say, where they are outed. And Alex has to somehow desperately try to manage this situation and keep it tamped down and prevent their secret from being further exposed and used against them. And when Zara goes into the bedroom in this hotel suite and she hears and catches Henry in the closet, there is a big full-length mirror right there next to Zara and Alex. And initially it's just reflecting back the room and the rumpled bed covers. But then once Henry is brought out of the closet and the three of them all have to sort of own up to what they've done, Alex is posed in such a way that we see his body reflected in that mirror. So again, there's this doubling of Alex. And we see these sort of two Alexes both speaking at once when they discuss who knows about the affair between Alex and Henry, right? So they're trying to figure out who sees what has been revealed to whom, and we have this double Alex. Now, it happens that early on, after the first couple times I watched this movie, I noticed the theme of mirrors, but I hadn't caught all of these instances, and I was sort of looking for them, collecting them, and then I saw on Twitter other fans of the movie alluding to the mirror scene. And I thought, oh, which one are they talking about? And eventually I realized they were talking about this scene in the hotel suite where Taylor Zakar Perez's body is displayed to especially impressive effect. And I thought, how did I not notice that one? But that is what some people refer to as the mirror scene. Now, after this point, as you know, if you've watched the movie, of course, Alex tells his parents about his relationship with Henry. They go to the lake house in Texas, but then Henry runs away, disappears, and cuts off communication with Alex. And Alex then has to pursue him, and he goes to Kensington Palace. He demands to be allowed in to see Henry. And this is Alex's first intrusion, you could say, into Henry's private world. It's his first time sort of forcing his way into Henry's life and his first time being allowed into Henry's private apartment and bedroom. And this sequence begins with a view of Henry coming out of his room into the foyer of Kensington Palace to receive Alex. And we see this first shot from Alex's point of view. And it happens that on the wall, the far wall of the foyer, below the balustrade where Henry is standing, we see a mirror. And if we zoom in, it looks like this. So this is a heavily ornate Baroque or Rococo gilt-framed mirror, which I would think is probably more extravagant than anything that one would actually see in Kensington Palace. But regardless, if we look into the sort of inner panel of this mirror, there's a central rectangular panel surrounded what looks like gilt vinework or fretwork in a sort of elaborate Rococo style. And then above that, there's another panel with gently curving crown-shaped arch, also of vinework or fretwork. And I took notice of this mirror in particular because to me it seems pretty reminiscent of this mirror, which, like that inner panel of that mirror in the movie, has this elaborate gilt vinework and then a sort of archway over the top, forming a sort of crown. Now, why does that matter, Sam? Well, because this second mirror happens to be on the wall of an English country house called Hetton Lawn, which is in the town of Charlton Kings, Gloucestershire, England. And this house was one of the childhood homes of Alice Little, whose family lived there in the 1860s. And this particular mirror, or looking glass, as it's also called, was located in the drawing room of this house when it was visited by the mathematician Charles Dodson, aka Lewis Carroll, who wrote the novel Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, inspired by Alice Little, and which was published in 1865. Now, 6 years later, Lewis Carroll published a second Alice novel, and this one was called Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. And in this novel, the heroine passes through the mirror into a strange parallel world in which language and logic are all reversed. The recurring theme of the novel is mirroring and doubling. So, for example, Alice meets the twins Tweedledee and Tweedledum, who mirror one another and complete one another's sentences. She also finds the book of nonsense backwards poetry called The Jabberwocky, which can only be read by holding it up to a mirror. So once I realized the importance of mirrors in Red, White, and Royal Blue, it happens that I watched the movie again in order to see specifically if there was anything there that might resemble Alice Little's mirror. And I think that this heavy Rococo gilt-framed mirror in the foyer of Kensington Palace is pretty closely reminiscent. It's up to the viewer to decide, but I think it's not an accident. And this mirror appears, as I said, just as Alex, whose name is remarkably close to Alice, is passing into Henry's enclosed world, which appears like a strange, distorted parallel version of his own. And this sort of sinister parallelism, I think, is underscored by Henry's words in the confrontation in his bedroom, where he says, for example, "My life is the crown and yours is politics, and I will not trade one prison for another." So he sees this sort of chilling parallel between their lives and worlds. And once again, this mirror sighting in the foyer is then followed by another rapid concatenation of mirrors, a lot like the one that we saw in the Texas campaign scene. So for one thing, when we see from Henry's vantage point looking down into the foyer and seeing Alex standing there, there are mirrors behind him on both sides of the arched doorway. So if we look to the one over to the right, there's this tall, slender mirror. And these mirrors in Kensington Palace repeatedly have male figures of some form reflected in them. And in this case, if we look at this foyer with Alex, there is a very bright, strong light coming into the foyer from the left. It's striking a sculptural bust against the wall to the right, which then casts a stark shadow onto the wall. And then if you look at the mirror next to the arched doorway, that shadow is reflected in the mirror. Then when Alex and Henry go into Henry's bedroom, when they are confronting one another and Henry turns towards us in the audience, we see a mirror between and behind them. And in this case, there's a sort of sculptural figure of possibly a male dancer in front of and reflected in the mirror, again, doubled, like these two men who are confronting one another and in a sense mirroring one another. Then, as we know, they go to the museum, then Alex goes home. After Alex returns home, we see Henry wake up in bed, and he finds out that they have been exposed. And when he goes out into his sort of sitting room and talks with Beatrice about what has happened, we again see a mirror against the wall and a lamp with a very similar fluted lampshade reflected in it. And that mirror is there in the frame as Sean, the equerry, walks in and explains that he has confiscated Henry's phone and computer and he has been isolated. And as he tells this to Henry, we see him standing right in front of that mirror, sort of looming behind him. And the fact that these mirrors represent the sort of splitting of the persona and the crisis of conflict between the private self and the public self, I think is driven home most of all in this scene when we are told that one of the two tabloid newspapers that have published and exposed Henry's private emails is called The Mirror. And we even see on the coffee table next to Henry and Beatrice the tabloid newspapers laid out, and the one most clearly visible there on top is The Mirror. So the final act of the movie, I think you can understand as the conflict and the tension between the public and private selves that both Henry and Alex have constructed coming to a head, and the two having to be somehow reconciled. That is dramatized in the scene in Buckingham Palace when Alex and Henry basically resolve that they're going to come out publicly, whatever the king thinks. And we see them talk and kiss through the French doorways of the Buckingham Palace balcony. And reflected in those glass doors, we're at the same time seeing the crowd and the city reflected. So we're seeing Henry and Alex still, in a sense, sort of veiled behind a quasi-mirror, right? Behind a reflective surface. And when they finally then walk out of these French doors onto the balcony, in a sense, they're coming out of the mirror. right? You can see it as sort of reversing Alex's journey into Kensington Palace. Well, now they're finally sort of passing back out of the mirror into the real world and revealing their true selves publicly. Now, this repeated use of mirrors, as we saw, it echoes, on the one hand, the Alfred Hitchcock film Vertigo. It also is very closely reminiscent of the movie that Henry actually cites himself as his favorite film, which is In the Mood for Love, this Chinese romantic drama made in 2000 in Hong Kong by the filmmaker Wong Kar-wai. And this movie is renowned for its rich and meticulously constructed visual texture. And in this movie, we have two characters who live next door to one another in the same apartment building. And each of them is married to someone else, and each of their spouses is cheating on them. And it happens they're cheating on them with one another. And the two of them figure this out, and it sort of draws them together. They start to have an emotional intimacy, and they also start imagining what would happen if they confronted their respective spouses about their cheating. And in some scenes, they actually act out, they role play, acting out the parts of their respective spouses. And again here you see this splitting into multiple personae and into the real and the imaginary. And this sort of confusion, the complexity and confusion of what is real and what is imagined, and the mystery, the unknowability of all the characters is again visually dramatized through mirror reflections. And I bring this movie up here because there are other ways in which you can see the inspiration and the influence of In the Mood for Love in Red, White, and Royal Blue. So as other critics and analysts have pointed out, in this film, the characters are always shown enclosed in usually narrow spaces like hallways and staircases, or seen through doorways. And basically, one never sees the edges of the screen open and unobstructed. So interior architecture always frames the characters, delimiting their space and at times almost seeming to suffocate them. And the meaning can be taken as paradoxical. It symbolizes, on the one hand, how these two people are forced by their circumstances into close proximity and hence intimacy, but also how they are constrained by their social environment, where they are always being watched and judged, and hence why they always have to be careful about how they are seen together. And architecture in different forms and ways is also always present in Red, White, and Royal Blue, both indoors and outdoors. So most of the movie takes place in quasi-public, quasi-private buildings, like palaces, hotels, hospitals. And the interior architecture of these spaces always frames and contains the characters. And we often see them as if we're peering into the enclosed private spaces and rooms within these larger public buildings. We often see them through doorways, such as in the London Hospital, in the White House, in the doorways both to Zara's office and to the Oval Office, and also to Alex's bedroom. And perhaps most notably in the New York hotel, when we see Alex and Henry, presumably after having sex, and we see them framed by this sort of asymmetrical arched doorway looking in from the sitting room into the bedroom, and we slowly zoom in through that doorway as we hear their conversation. There also obviously are closets. More than once, the main characters are hidden inside of closets, like in the hospital in London and then again in the hotel in New York when Henry is hiding from Zara. And this can be taken as the ultimate, most extreme illustration of constraint, right? There's this obvious visual pun drawing on the metaphor of the closet as a social space in which one hides one's sexuality. But also, closets appear in different forms. For instance, in Alex's room, we see his glass closets. The closet with his shoes appears especially often. It's a reminder of Alex's vanity and his self-cultivation. And it's also a very ambiguous symbol. So on the one hand, this glass closet can seem to be more open, lighter, transparent, in keeping with the overall style of Alex's bedroom. And Alex's room, too, has this sort of tension and ambiguity. You can see it as more warm and personal. It is also more modern, with open spaces, solid colors, the proverbial clean lines. And this taste is reflected in the architecture books that we see in his room. So in the scene where Alex and Henry are talking on the couch after the first time they have sex, in the background behind Henry, we see Alex's bookshelf. And there's this large collection of big, heavy architecture books, which are on all forms of modernist architecture, such as Bauhaus, which is sort of the forerunner of mid-century modern that came out of Germany. And others focus especially on styles that use a lot of open space and glass. For instance, there's a book here on the design firm AB Concept based in Hong Kong, which is known for using glass and chrome and a lot of light, soft pastel colors. And there's another book called Modern Views, which is on ultra-modern houses, such as Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House, which is famous for its totally transparent glass walls opening out onto the landscape. So Alex clearly is interested specifically in architecture and interior decoration as a way of expressing his own tastes. And it's in keeping with Alex's more open, informal personality. And it can be seen as more free and refreshing compared to the heavy, ornate interiors of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. But nonetheless, as Alex's affair with Henry intensifies, these clear open spaces and glass surfaces, like on his glass closets, take on a different meaning. So after the New Year's Eve scene, when Alex is confused and distressed, both about Henry's behavior and about his own sexual identity, he pulls Nora aside and tries to have a conversation with her about his turmoil. And they are in an office with walls made of glass, and they are constantly being seen and interrupted. And the glass here comes to represent the impossibility of privacy. It creates a sense of exposure and even threat. And then this is alluded to again right after this scene in the reception to the state dinner, when Alex is again in a state of anxiety. He doesn't know whether Henry will show up. And on screen we see Henry's name tag refracted through a glass, alluding to the sort of distortion of Henry's public image, which makes it impossible to understand him clearly and directly. So these allusions then give new meaning to the glass in Alex's room. It now appears more ambiguous. It can allude to and invoke the anxiety of exposure, of being misunderstood, and specifically it can be seen as another visual pun, in this case on the phrase the glass closet, which is a common term for a style of life where a person has a more or less openly gay love life, and it is basically an open secret what their sexual orientation is, but they never explicitly confirm it. So your sexuality, in a sense, is seen, but not openly heard or spoken of. So this is an unstable situation. And so glass in the movie is a highly ambiguous and ambivalent symbol. And this carries over, I think, then into the lake house sequence in Texas. So the lake house stands out in the movie. And for one thing, it's the only actual private home that we see in the entire movie, other than just the exterior facade of the house in Austin. And the lake house stands out as an inviting and unassuming space, open and spacious but modest, low to the ground, literally as we see from the outside. The interior is decorated in a modern Mexican-inflected style, and one can see Alex's father's clear influence on Alex's own taste. It is brightly lit with long banks of picture windows opening out onto the yard, which can be seen to symbolize Alex's and Henry's relative freedom to be more openly intimate, and you could say transparent. It's also here, of course, that Alex resolves to declare his love to Henry and to press for a committed relationship. And it is also here then that Henry becomes overwhelmed and flees. So the big banks of glass here in the lake house have this double meaning. And further, in a more subtle way, even just ordinary windows, which might have curtains or blinds drawn where we don't even see the glass. Windows repeatedly appear throughout the movie, and they often loom over and behind the characters. And time and again, when characters have unpleasant or contentious conversations, we see them set against the backdrop of very tall windows, reaching up out of the frame and looming over the characters, thus backlighting them through thin white curtains or stained glass. And we see this motif from early on, for example, in Buckingham Palace, when Henry and Alex first have an initial fight leading to the cake disasters. There are tall windows with stained glass looming behind them. And then high curtained windows appear in many contentious or tense scenes, such as repeatedly in the White House. In the New York hotel, when Zara catches Alex and Henry, and most especially in Kensington Palace, in the tense, awkward interview scene, and then again after the rupture between Alex and Henry, and then again after the email leak. And these windows seem to represent a subtle social pressure constantly being exerted, the threat of exposure and judgment. So we are always aware of the outside world, in a sense, trying to look in through these thin curtains. And it also happens that this use of windows gives very complex shape and texture to the lighting of the characters. It's remarkable how often the characters in this movie, which, many say looks like a Hallmark movie, it has this sort of glossy style. It's remarkable how often the characters are backlit or half-lit. And the window motif allows for a great deal of this backlighting and half-lighting. Even when there is bright sunlight, the characters are still often largely in shadow. Like in the Kensington Palace interview scene. If these two people were being filmed, it's amazing that none of these journalists said, maybe we shouldn't have this bright window right behind you. And their faces appear kind of dark and shadowy against that bright background. Then again, in the Paris cafe scene, even when we are learning about Henry, and in a sense he's opening up, he is dramatically backlit through this big window. And then Alex, too, when we see him face on, you might expect that he'll just be brightly and clearly front-lit. But in fact, we see his face half-shadowed, in a sense repeating this motif of the mirrors, right, where Alex seems to be splitting into two personae. And most dramatically, I think, in the Democratic Convention, when Alex gives a speech. Of all times and places, this is where you would expect him to be nicely, clearly, and brightly front-lit, and yet once again we see his face split half into shadow. This tension, you could say, of the darker, the shadow self always being there in view somehow, this does not resolve until the ending of the movie in Buckingham Palace when they confront the king. And finally, when the characters see the crowds of supporters gathering outside, we finally see Henry fully and clearly front-lit. And then both characters step out into the sunlight. So in some, interior architecture, in the sense of arrangements of space, light, and bodies in interiors, is crucial and symbolic all throughout the movie, in almost every scene. But also, the story is punctuated by images, usually briefer images in the distance, of exterior and especially monumental architecture. So the characters are often dwarfed by massive buildings and facades. This starts right from the beginning, such as when we see Henry as a tiny figure on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And then again, it's repeated when Alex first arrives at the palace and gets out of the limo to attend the wedding reception. We see the facade of another wing of the palace looming behind him. And I think this shot was filmed from a long distance, with the cameras then zooming far in order to emphasize the enormity of the building looming over Alex and Nora. And architecture is almost always framing and containing the characters when they're together, even when they're outside. For instance, we first see Alex and Henry together framed by this loggia in front of the entranceway into the Buckingham Palace ballroom. And then when they're walking outside in the park in Paris, we see them arrive through this dramatic triumphal archway, which then looms in the background behind them. And in this way, I think it emphasizes the lack of freedom of movement, right? Their paths are always somehow contained and constrained by the designs of others. And this same theme is driven home even more, I think, in the Kensington Palace garden scene, right? So this is where Henry has run away from Alex, he goes back to England, and he's talking with his sister, really apparently his only confidant. He's talking with his sister in the gardens, and these are lush and beautiful, but very formal, delimited by straight, narrow paths and sharp borders. And this can be seen to symbolize Henry's rich and in many ways privileged but severely constrained life. So overall, the movie has this sort of back and forth dialectic between cramped and constrained private spaces and looming and overwhelming public spaces, which I think can be seen to represent the tension between public and private lives and public and private selves. And arguably, you could say the best balance between the two seems to be the Texas Lake House, but even this, as we saw, is very ambiguous. And there's also an ambiguity you can see in the appearance of towering monumental buildings, right? Which, as I said, in some respects are intimidating, overwhelming, but they can also be seen to represent strength and confidence, which the characters long for, and their hopes and aspirations, especially that come with their public positions. So, of course, there's the White House, which is repeatedly seen as a watching presence, such as over the New Year's Eve party, which is where Alex and Henry first kiss. And then even inside the White House, there are constant reminders in case you forget where they are. So there are two scenes, both in Zara's office, where a character decides to take a risk to help Alex. And these are sort of pivotal moments for him. One is where the president comes to Zara and asks to read Alex's campaign memo. And then another is where Zara calls Sean in order to get Alex back in contact with Henry. And both times we see prints of the design of the White House over the shoulder of that character. So it's almost as if the White House is a sort of watching, protective, or benevolent presence. Additionally, monumental buildings are seen on screen where Alex and Henry are intimate. Firstly, when they hook up in the White House, just as they begin to have sex for the first time, the picture cuts away to an image of the Washington Monument, almost as like a stand-in substitute for the sexual scene that we're not seeing. And then later in the Paris hotel, where Henry proposes that the two of them make love, we see the Eiffel Tower in the window. So these, I think, can, for one thing, underscore the contrast between the small, intimate, private affair between these two men and the dramatic, public, even historical implications that this affair might have. And these two towers, the Washington Monument and the Eiffel Tower, also serve to introduce the next major motif of the movie, which we should talk about, which is, of course, phallic symbols. So phallic symbols also appear repeatedly throughout the movie, first in more obvious forms with relatively clear or even blunt sexual meanings, but then they reappear in more subtle ways, gradually taking on more nuanced subtexts, not just sexual, but also alluding to the emotional attraction. So the most obvious phallic symbols, as we've seen, are buildings. And the Washington Monument is perhaps the most glaring. We see it repeatedly, for one thing, from the porch of the White House when Alex and his father are talking about Henry. And it happens that in this same conversation, Alex's father is smoking a cigar, which is a sort of classic, almost cliche phallic symbol. Then we see the monument again in the New Year's Eve sequence when Alex goes out to find Henry in the snow, and they then have their first kiss. And then it appears a third time, unless I've missed some other ones. It appears a third time during this sex scene in Alex's bedroom. And by this point in the movie, we have been primed to think of monumental buildings as phallic symbols. Because, for one thing, just earlier that evening when the lovers come out of the Red Room after making out and they're still sort of sexually excited, they play this kind of game of innuendos, referring to Henry's erection by way of famous British landmarks like Big Ben and Nelson's Column. And so this sort of gives the game away, but the theme of phallic-shaped British buildings had actually been more subtly alluded to earlier in the montage that flashes on the screen when Alex is flying back to London for a second time in order to do fake press events with Henry. We see posts apparently on Instagram with iconic buildings like Nelson's Column, also the Tower of London with its phallic-shaped corner turrets, and the Tower Bridge over the Thames River, Big Ben. And also in an image that's perhaps less immediately recognizable to Americans, we also see the modern office tower in the city of London, which is technically called by its address 30 Mary Axe, but it's more commonly called the Gherkin in reference to its sort of pickle shape. And it's also sometimes given more racy nicknames like the Towering Innuendo or the Crystal Phallus. So this theme of phallic-shaped monumental buildings establishes an association between public power and masculinity, which Henry and Alex's affair can be seen to both reaffirm in a way and also undermine or threaten. At the same time, in counterpoint, we also see more subtle and smaller phallic symbols appearing as the men become closer. So apart from that aforementioned cigar, we also see in the deleted scene from the Kensington Palace kitchen, Henry and Alex share cornettos, cornetto meaning little horn. And in the New Year's Eve party, shortly before Henry and Alex's first kiss, we see Henry nursing a wine bottle, which can be seen to prefigure their first sexual encounter in Alex's bedroom. And further, to look more at that scene, immediately after that cutaway view of the Washington Monument, we come back to Alex's room and we see Alex buckling his belt with his shirt left open. And this is where Henry asks him about the key around his neck. And this key is another phallic symbol due to its shape and its position, and also since it comes right on the heels of that Washington Monument cutaway with its relatively blunt phallic symbolism. So Henry's curiosity about Alex's key can be seen to echo his fascination with Alex's body and his sexuality, but it also quickly takes on, of course, greater narrative and emotional meaning. So for Alex, the key represents security and a sense of rootedness that he associates with his home in Austin, which he wants to hang on to now that he's in the White House. But it also has further implications and contrasting meanings. So the key is phallic and hence linked to Alex's sexuality, but also to his emotions. It rests directly over his heart, and so it presages that for Alex, sex will lead to love, right? The phallus is close to the heart. And hence it makes sense that the key stays on, even sometimes during sex. Now for Henry, it takes on different resonances right away. So Henry's response when Alex explains this is the key to his childhood home, Henry says, "I don't think I've ever owned a key in my entire life." And this is very ambiguous. Like most things that we see and hear about Henry in this early stage of the movie, it's highly ambiguous. Alex takes it to reflect Henry's unbounded privilege and power. And he says, quote, "No such thing as a locked door when you're a prince, I suppose." We then get an immediate rejoinder suggesting that this is not the real or whole story. And Henry says, quote, "You'd be surprised." And this ambiguity, okay, what does this key represent and what does the lack of a key represent to Henry? This is left unresolved until much later in the movie when we learn of the personal and political constraints on Henry's life. So for Henry, his lack of a key does not represent his ability to open any door that he wishes, but something more like the opposite. And hence there's a great irony when later at Kensington Palace, we do see Henry with a key. So after their confrontation, Henry, of course, takes Alex out to the V&A Museum. And when he leads him out, they have to sneak out of the palace gateway. So this scene, I think, is easily misunderstood. They're not sneaking into the museum here, but rather out of the palace complex and into the public streets of Kensington, London. And in order to get out of the gate, Henry must retrieve a hidden key out of a drain pipe and use it to unlock the gate. So the implication here, if you think about it, is that Henry is locked into the palace at night, and he can only get out in secret by subterfuge. And this can be seen to represent here Henry's mental and spiritual imprisonment, you could say, in the world of the royal family, and also his mental and spiritual escape from this role into his own sort of constructed alternative world of sentiment and fantasy. And that line, "I've never owned a key in my life," is also then, again, ironically referred back to in the tarmac scene the next morning when Alex is leaving. And the two of them exchange love tokens, right? And this has clear emotional symbolism, right? Henry says he's giving a part of himself to Alex. You could see that as representing his heart or his trust. And Alex, in exchange, gives him his key. And you could see this as, Alex giving the key to his heart to Henry. But also, at the same time, this is inseparable from the sexual symbolism. So they have this exchange where Alex gives Henry his key, and Henry, in return, gives Alex his ring. Need I say more? So here again, the sexual and the emotional are linked, right? The same symbols have this double resonance. And you can see this same kind of double meaning again in the most pervasive phallic symbol in the movie, which is ties. So the tie is a phallic symbol like the key because of its position and its shape. And ties appear repeatedly throughout the movie, often shown prominently in ways that echo and draw the eye downward towards the genital area. Both characters at different times wear eye-catching ties with striking patterns or colors, but more often Henry. There are countless scenes where we see Henry wearing a tie and Alex not. And sometimes he's seen wearing them even at very strange times, like, say, riding in a Jeep on a country road, or late at night in the kitchen when he sneaks in to get ice cream from the freezer. Why are you wearing a tie late at night eating ice cream? This is very strange. The tie rests upon the chest, and it is sometimes hidden and sometimes revealed, and can be seen in this way as a kind of equivalent symbol for Henry to the key for Alex. But also, like the key, ties have multiple levels of meaning. And superficially, you can see the ties as representing Henry's formality and stuffiness, but it's also significant, as we said, that it covers over the area of the heart. And hence the tie can be seen as a reference to the armor that Henry says that he wears to protect his heart. And the tie in this way is the most important part of the larger formal wardrobe that Henry habitually uses to conceal his private self and manage his perception in the eyes of the world, and even sometimes conceal himself from his own sexual partners, such as in that post-coital scene in Alex's bedroom, where we see that Henry has remained fully dressed in a tuxedo all through this sexual encounter. So there's a contrast in this way between the tie and the key as sexual symbols. In a sense, they are even opposites. Whereas one unlocks hidden spaces, the other encloses them by literally tying formal clothing together. And hence you can take this to symbolize that for Alex, sex necessarily leads to intimacy, to opening, revelation, disclosure. Whereas for Henry, sex can serve as practically a barrier to intimacy, right? Managing and obscuring his internal feelings. And as we discussed in part 2, Henry is able to sort of manage and contain his sexual life in this kind of enclosed world of famous and wealthy men. Well, where does this start to change, right? Because clearly by the end of the movie, Henry's sexual intimacy with Alex has taken on great emotional power. So where does this begin to change? Well, apparently it's in Paris. So in the beginning of the hotel room scene in Paris, where they first have penetrative sex, we see Henry in a suit and tie, fully formal clothing. He then proposes that they make love. This is the first point in the movie where either character uses this word love. And then he starts to undress himself, taking off first his jacket and then undoing his tie. And this is the first point in the movie where we see Henry undress himself at all. It's followed then by the first point where we see his unclothed body. And then only much later at the lake house do we first see Henry in informal clothes, not wearing a suit or a uniform. So this is a very obvious evolution. But the lake house is also, of course, where Henry decides to run away. And when he sneaks out at night, we see him again putting on formal clothes. So the tie in this way is a symbol of Henry's negotiation between security and vulnerability, concealment and revelation. But even beyond that, the tie is a complex and multifaceted symbol, even in fashion more broadly, right? So the tie is the one universal required accoutrement of men's formal attire, but also at the same time, it's the only aspect of the male wardrobe that allows for some visible variation and hence for the expression of personal taste, especially through colors and patterns. And it is not just significant whether Henry or Alex is wearing a tie or not, but also what sort of tie and what it conveys. They often have dramatic patterns, like Henry's tie in the Kensington Palace scene with these striking diagonal stripes pointing the eye downward. And also, the characters more than once explicitly refer to the color or pattern of Henry's tie, such as, of course, when Alex disparages Henry's dull gray tie in Vogue, and then later when Alex takes note of Henry's more vibrantly colored tie at the New Year's Eve party. And this reference can suggest, of course, that Henry is taking more aesthetic risks, a greater willingness to express his feelings, and this presages then what he's going to do later after midnight, right? When he finally sort of crosses the line physically with Alex. But even when Alex takes notice of this, saying, you're rocking the orange, Henry still criticizes and teases Alex for lacking subtlety and acuity in his perceptions, saying you must be colorblind.
Nice tie! Rocking the orange.
Orange? Must be colorblind. This is obviously copper.
And this can be taken then to allude symbolically to Alex's failure to read the subtleties of Henry's expressions and understand his feelings. So not only the tie, but how the different characters respond and comment on it takes on this emotional symbolism. And then finally, much later in the third act on election night, when Henry wants to give Alex a sense of grounding and reassurance, he wears a tie with a pattern of yellow roses, which are associated, as he says, with Texas, like the key to his Texas home. And further, this tie and the yellow rose pattern can be taken to allude specifically to an interracial romance. So the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas, is a love ballad from the 19th century, which has a racial subtext, right? Yellow at that time was used to refer to people of mixed and specifically Latin heritage. And that song has been used in other films such as Giant that involve interracial relationships. But what I love most here is how Henry calls Alex's attention to the tie. He wants to distract him from the tension of the moment, and he again teases Alex, saying, "You still haven't noticed my tie." And so once more, Henry is chiding Alex for his lack of perception. And at the same time, I think you can also take this line as Henry talking to the audience, right? Telling us in the audience to pay close attention to the symbolism of small details. And finally, this incident also shows that specifically the color of ties is significant. Ties are just one canvas on which the movie paints a picture using symbolic colors. So colors with symbolic meanings appear all throughout the movie. But as other fans have pointed out, the three thematic colors in the title, red, white, and blue, appear especially prominently, and they take on certain symbolic associations. So red and blue seem to be the most prevalent and most important, and red, of course, is traditionally associated with passion, and blue with dignity, reserve, and also melancholy. And when we see the two lovers, Alex and Henry, together, red is most often linked to Alex and blue to Henry. For instance, in the lake scene in Texas, we see Alex wearing red swimming trunks and blue for Henry. Now, what is more, the movie can be roughly divided, as I've said before, into 3 acts. Basically, the start of the movie through the polo scene, more or less, is the first act, and then from Paris through the museum scene is the second act, and then from the email hack that on to the end is the third act. And a different thematic color predominates in each act. First red, then white, or really more yellow and white, and then finally blue. So to look at red first, this appears dramatically in the opening sequences of the movie at the wedding in London, with red carpets and clothing and even news banners on the TV screens, and the red furniture and deep crimson red walls of the Buckingham Palace ballroom. It seems to allude to love and passion, naturally connected to the wedding and the newlyweds, but also further to these two men and their suppressed attraction to one another, which will eventually lead to love. And it culminates, of course, with the two of them sprawled out on the red carpet with the heavily symbolic cake toppling over on them. The theme is then echoed in the state dinner scene, with again the red carpets and the president's vibrant red dress, and most importantly and strikingly in the red room scene in the White House, which is reminiscent of iconic scenes in other films, such as we saw, the restaurant scene in Vertigo, and also in Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love. Similarly places the lovers into lush, rich, red interiors, especially in the bedrooms and hotels where they almost consummate their emotional affair. And finally, it's also evocative of the gymnasium dance scene in West Side Story, where the two lovers first meet. And this scene is also evoked in a different way in the New Year's Eve party scene in Red, White, and Royal Blue, specifically in the surreal moment when the other dancers disappear out of view and the two lovers only see one another. But regardless, the color red continues on as a leitmotif connected with sexual passion, such as the big, vibrant red couch on which Henry and Alex first consummate their affair sexually, and it culminates arguably with the polo scene in Henry's red polo uniform, in which we first see his athletic body being displayed and which inflames Alex's passion. But we can see that the polo scene is also already transitional. There are elements of blue and white in that uniform as well. And just after this point, beginning in the scenes in Paris, the color palette shifts towards lighter but still warm colors. And the Paris hotel room where they make love is decorated in shades of yellow and gold and suffused with soft amber light. And these colors seem to represent a shift from feverish passion to a warm, comfortable intimacy. And starting with the conversation in bed after that sex scene, the yellows and golds begin to lighten and pools of white begin to appear. This sort of palette is then seen again in the New York hotel scene, where we have white and gray walls and the lovers' soft white bathrobes. And it's interesting that neither of these places, neither in Paris nor New York, neither of them belongs to the characters. Both of them are only rented. And the only actual private space that either of them seems to have with this sort of warm color palette is the music room in Kensington Palace, which clearly is a place of comfort and refuge for Henry. Now, also immediately after that New York hotel scene, we see a similar palette of soft, light colors in the Oval Office, where Alex comes out to his mother. But there is a further cooling with touches of blue in the scene, including Alex's blue clothing. And these mixed colors emphasize the ambiguous situation in this scene, where Alex's mother is also at the same time the head of state. And the palette gives a sense of familial warmth and intimacy, but mixed with notes of anxiety as to the political ramifications of Alex's affair with Henry. Now, this is only one of many clearly meaningful appearances of the color blue, which gradually become more prevalent. Blue is the most ambiguous color in the movie. For Alex, it's clearly associated with politics and with his public image. It first appears prominently in the form of the blue sweatshirt that he wears when talking to Nora about his anxiety and confusion stemming from his attraction to Henry. And then it starts to appear everywhere, almost totally taking over the screen, in the montage of Alex's campaign activities in Texas. And here it is clearly associated with his rising public profile and the insecurities that he has to mask as he becomes a public figure. Now, as for Henry, Henry wears blue much more frequently and consistently throughout the movie, in almost every scene, in fact. And it's similarly associated here with performance, but also with privacy and safety. and it reflects Henry's long-time ability to protect himself, to keep emotional distance from the outside world, and to rely upon his own inner strength. And the color appears and reappears regardless of formal or informal contexts. Even when he's hanging around at the lake house, where he's dressed the most informally and he's acting the most freely, he still appears in blue, also when doing karaoke or going swimming. And when he panics because he feels that he is getting too close to Alex, he plunges into the lake, and we see a view of him totally bathed in blue. So he's sort of retreating into this private and hidden world represented by the color blue. He then dresses in blue when he sneaks out and runs away at night, and we see him again bathed in blue on the plane flying back to Britain. Blue seems to allude to the armor that Henry is always wearing, and it delimits a world that Alex, as of yet, cannot access. But this changes, most clearly, of course, with the museum scene, where Henry is again totally bathed in blue. Now it seems to represent a sort of shadow world where Henry can disappear, and his blue sweatshirt, which echoes very closely Alex's sweatshirt from the first act, so much so that some viewers assumed it was the same one. It echoes Alex's sweatshirt, and it also here allows Henry to blend in to this shadowy environment. And as he says, quote, "You can slip between the statues like a shadow." And incidentally, this line is another allusion to West Side Story, which contains a character called Nobodies, who is apparently biologically female, but who wants to be considered one of the boys and to be accepted into this gang. So they're sort of taking on this alternate persona in this kind of shadowy world of the gangs. And Nobodies brags that their main advantage that they offer to the gang is stealth. And they brag that they can, quote, "slip from shadow to shadow like wind through a fence." So Henry similarly can disappear into this nocturnal world, both of the museum on the literal level and also of his own mind and imaginings. And the irony of this scene, of course, is that he's telling all of this to Alex, whom he has now brought and allowed into this world with him, and who silently follows and watches Henry like his own shadow. So here, Henry is no longer alone in this private world. And following the museum scene, we see the two of them waking up again in bed, like in Paris, again surrounded by the same tones of soft white and amber. Then in the final act, after the email leak has come out, blue reasserts itself with a vengeance. The scene of Alex's speech, where he divulges the fact of their affair, is totally blue, and this scene is critical here in uniting the different meanings of the color blue, where it comes to represent both public visibility and also privacy. And this is where Alex and Henry begin to close the divide and to reconcile their public and private personae. And when they confront the king in Buckingham Palace, they both wear blue. And they are in blue then when they step out onto the balcony to be seen publicly as a couple for the first time. And a lot of these themes then are finally tied together on election night in Austin. So as we know, the colors red, white, and blue are invoked in the title because they are associated with both the United States and Great Britain. But also they're specifically associated with U.S. electoral politics. And the big goal of election night here is to turn Texas blue, so to speak, in the sense of winning the state for the Democrats. And when the tension and anxiety around the election is too great, Henry pulls Alex aside into a semi-private space with warm yellow and gold colors, again representing comfort and intimacy, and he points out his yellow tie. Now finally they find out that Alex's mother has won and that Texas can be colored in blue on the map. And this then takes on a double positive meaning, right? It is the private personal victory represented by Alex and Henry's relationship, and at the same time the public political victory. And the two of them are again surrounded by dramatic, vibrant blue when they walk out on stage together on election night. So the symbolic colors tell the story of this shifting and evolving relationship and its different meanings. So I started this video by talking about the theme of mirrors, which I think is most closely linked to Alex. And now we've seen different themes and motifs that deal with both of them and their relationship with one another. Now, lastly, I want to talk about a couple of important themes that are most closely linked to Henry, and one of them is classical music. So this movie has a very rich and varied soundtrack, including both incidental music, meaning music that's heard on the audio track that we in the audience hear, but the characters do not, and also diegetic music, meaning music that happens in the world of the movie that the characters also hear. And there's an interesting sort of interplay between the two at many points in the movie. Some is incidental music that was composed specifically for the movie by the composer Sophia Hultquist, also known by her stage name Drum and Lace. And there was a very interesting interview with Sophia on the podcast Big Gay Energy, which I will link to in the description. But most of the music that we hear on the soundtrack is modern popular music. And it's clearly very important to setting the mood and telling the story of the movie, but I really know nothing about it. I'm going to leave that aside. There are others who are much more knowledgeable and qualified to talk about popular music. But also classical music plays a very important symbolic role in the movie. And there are a number of very meaningful musical allusions, which I can speak to. And that's the reason why I titled this video The Visual and Symbolic Language of Red, White, and Royal Blue. Not just visual, that's what I was thinking initially. But really, I realized that these musical references are so important that I sort of expanded the scope. And there are 5 classical music pieces that we hear over the course of the film, comprising work by 4 composers, Schubert, Strauss, Mozart, and Bach. And they are heard in 3 different scenes at different important junctures in the movie. So firstly, in the Buckingham Palace wedding scene, we hear a string quartet, which is warm and upbeat, appropriate for a celebration. And as I discussed some in part 1 of this series, Alex assumes that the piece is Mozart, and Henry corrects him with a hint of annoyance, saying actually it's Schubert. And Schubert is a fellow Austrian composer like Mozart, who came along about a generation later and was never as famous as Mozart, and who had a more, you could say, surreal and dreamy romantic style. And the piece that we hear playing is String Quartet number 10. It's often played at private home gatherings and celebrations. And Schubert wrote this piece at the age of 16. So it was an early piece, and it's forgivable to mistake it for Mozart. There's a lot of influence there from Mozart. But this error feeds into the mounting tension between the two men, leading eventually towards a physical scuffle. And we see that immediately after Alex smears icing on Henry, the music switches, and it switches to a waltz, meaning a tune that is set to a 3/4 beat, and that is understood to be graceful and elegant, good for dancing. And specifically, this tune is probably the most famous waltz ever composed, namely the Blue Danube, which was written in 1866 by Johann Strauss II, another Austrian composer who came along another generation after Schubert, and who wrote a series of waltzes, which provided music mainly for the famously elegant balls of Vienna. And this version is conducted by Philip Millman and is provided courtesy of the Lud and Schlatz Musical Emporium. Now, there's a lot of irony to hearing this tune. It is a reference to upper-class refinement and elegance, the exact sort of environment in which Alex is uncomfortable and feels himself to be out of place. And hence it makes sense to hear it alongside Alex's bumbling and fumbling. But also, at the same time, ballroom dancing, and specifically the waltz, was considered to be romantic and even erotic. So when one danced a waltz, one embraced one's partner rather than simply holding hands like in an old-fashioned country dance. And this was considered rather risque, and it was the perfect opportunity then for courtship and flirting, and even a test for sexual compatibility with your partner. So the subtext here is that Alex and Henry, even while scuffling, are engaging in a kind of dance, even a flirtatious, erotic dance. And additionally, there is a reference here back to the book. So in the novel of Red, White, and Royal Blue, Alex attends this wedding at Buckingham along with his sister June Claremont Diaz, who does not appear in the movie. And Henry asks June to dance, and they dance a waltz. So to Alex, this seems to be in keeping with Henry's sort of stuffy and effete image. But gradually as the story goes on, it becomes clear that Henry had asked June to dance only in order to get Alex's attention, and maybe even to make him jealous. And later, when the two of them go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, they play music, and Alex asks, "Aren't you going to ask me to waltz?" To which Henry replies, "No waltzing, never cared for it." So there's an irony here that Henry is disavowing the waltz, and the dance can be seen as a symbol here for heterosexuality. It's the expected convention in formal or upper-class environments, which Henry engages in for the sake of appearances, but never actually liked or even privately resented, and it serves to cover up his real tastes and interests. So in the movie, this dance between Henry and June has been taken out, but the waltz has been added in now as a musical accompaniment to Alex and Henry's physical scuffle in the ballroom in front of the cake. And hence, in this sense, it carries a strong sexual and romantic subtext, implying that when the two men cannot dance and flirt openly, that would not be accepted, then their attraction is sublimated into their verbal and physical sparring, finally culminating in the cake disaster, which can be seen as symbolizing and foreshadowing the love affair and the scandal that it's going to cause. Now, later in the movie, after Henry has openly shown his attraction to Alex, but then has cut him off, run away, and there's this lingering uncertainty, we hear another classical music piece during the state dinner. In this initial reception period, when Alex is waiting nervously to see whether Henry will show up or not, we hear a classical piano piece, specifically by Bach, and it is the Goldberg Variation number 17, and this version is performed by Shelley Katz and published by Muse Open. So this piece is part of a longer series of 30 short songs for a keyboard instrument, all based upon a simple recurring theme, and most of them with a soothing and meditative sound. And reportedly, Bach wrote them for a diplomat who had insomnia and wanted help in getting to sleep. So this piece of music on the soundtrack gives a sense of calm and of a serene atmosphere at this dinner, providing an ironic contrast, again, to Alex's state of turmoil and agitation. And then this is further underscored by Amy's paranoid reaction when Alex asks her for help. She immediately asks, "Where's the threat? Do we need to clear the room?" Then, of course, in the Red Room, we see the two lovers united and sharing a passionate kiss. And there are foreshadowings here of chaos, with the two of them nearly knocking over a table and a painting, and then finally Amy walking in and catching them. Subsequently, as they walk out back into the state dinner, the music here changes to Wolfgang Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. So right away, there's a little irony here just in the fact that it is Mozart, right? So Alex was wrong when he misidentified the Schubert piece in Buckingham as Mozart. But now that we're back in America where, things are slightly less sophisticated, we actually do hear Mozart. And specifically, it's the Rondo alla Turca, which is the final movement of Mozart's Piano Sonata number 11. And the title Rondo alla Turca means finale in the Turkish style, and it imitates the marching bands of the Turkish Janissary Corps, which were the elite military units that maintained Ottoman power in Eastern Europe back in the 1700s when Mozart was writing. And the Ottoman bands reportedly played loud, boisterous music as the Janissaries approached enemy positions, creating a sense of threat to intimidate opponents. And Mozart's rondo is, of course, upbeat and dramatic. It captures the sense of excitement and also confidence, you might say overconfidence, as the lovers initiate their affair and brazenly risk exposure. And it can also be taken as suggesting a hint of menace, as Alex and Henry's recklessness will eventually get them into trouble. Now, finally, much later in the third act of the movie, we hear several musical pieces in rapid succession at the time when Alex and Henry are reunited at Kensington Palace after being cut off because of the email leak and scandal. So I think that this reunion scene is really the culmination and emotional climax of the movie, after their relationship and their sanity has been tested to the limit, and yet they survive. And the scene starts with Henry playing piano in the music room, and Sean approaches him with a phone, and Alex and Henry talk over the phone, and as they converse, the picture cuts to the stairway. So there's a disjuncture here between what we're seeing and what we're hearing. And in the stairway, we see Alex arrive, as on the soundtrack, he is promising to, quote, break the sound barrier to get to Henry. And this alludes back to the song that Henry sang on karaoke back in Texas. And one of the lyrics is, "I want to make a supersonic man out of you." And he sings this line while pointing to Alex. So this allusion back to the karaoke scene underscores the importance of music to their relationship and their emotional communication. And also the karaoke scene is the first time that we see Alex stare at Henry adoringly, clearly realizing that he is in love. Now later in this Kensington Palace scene, as we see Alex arrive, Henry rushes out to greet him, and we hear simple incidental music, probably a synth pad, playing as they talk. Then, just as the lovers collide in the middle of the staircase, the music changes to a classical piano piece. And it can seem at first as if this is again incidental music. But then the picture cuts back to the music room, and we see that actually it's not incidental music, but Henry is playing it on the piano. That's what we're hearing. And again, Alex is looking at Henry adoringly, and this time smiling. We can see here confirmed that Alex is attracted to Henry's courage and poise as in his musical performances. Now, what is this piece that Henry is playing? Well, it's another song by Bach, like the Goldberg variation that we heard earlier in the White House. And specifically, it is a song called Schaffe können sicher weiden, composed in 1713. And yes, that is the song that I've been using as the intro music to these videos, which no one seems to have noticed. But regardless, I have been using the version recorded by Marco Cera, arranged for oboe and mandolin. It was originally written for soprano voice and recorders with a bass accompaniment. In the movie, it's played on piano by Nicholas Galitzine. If I understand correctly, I think the actor is actually playing the song. And what you're hearing right now in this video is a version arranged for the organ. So this song is very dense with symbolism that is deeply important to the story, but I will leave that aside for now. We'll come back to that later. But for now, it's enough just to note that the song has a calming, reassuring sound, much like the Goldberg variation, but more joyful and fitting for this mood of reunion. It expresses, I think, the sense of relief and of safety now that the two lovers are back together. Now, rather than playing the whole piece to completion, Henry switches abruptly into Yankee Doodle Dandy, which is of course long known as an American patriotic song, and perhaps one of the most corny. And this can be seen as gently mocking Alex, the American who rides in to the rescue. But it also has very complex historical and political resonances. So the song began in the mid-1700s as a British folk song sung mainly by British soldiers to mock Americans. casting American colonials as country bumpkins who ride into towns and take on pretensions of sophistication and high fashion. They try to be dandies by doing things like sticking feathers in their caps. But then, not long after, during the American Revolution, Americans took up the song ironically. After capturing British regulars, the Americans would then march them to prisoner of war encampments, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy for them, as if saying, "Who's laughing now?" Now, Alex evidently recognizes this tune right away. I didn't get this immediately. I couldn't quite tell what was going on. But Alex evidently immediately recognizes the song and the humor and irony that it's conveying, right? So he immediately smiles and looks amused. But then a moment later, he, in a sense, gets his own joke in when he goes over to the piano, sits down next to Henry, and plunks out a tune that he clearly has just learned. And this also is full of irony and double meaning. So the tune will be recognizable right away to most Americans as another patriotic song called My Country 'Tis of Thee. And it happens that's how you see the song identified in the subtitles on Amazon. I don't know why, but most Americans will not know that tune is taken directly from the British royal anthem, God Save the King, and hence the tune has different meanings for British and American ears, just like the colors red, white, and blue in the title have different meanings for a British or American audience. And Alex apparently recognizes this double meaning, since immediately after they finish playing this little ditty, Alex asks Henry, "Have you spoken with your grandfather?" referring to the king. And in a sense, I think this moment marks the final transition from the second act of the movie, where the central question is whether Alex and Henry will have a real lasting relationship, to the third act, where the conflict is about the political ramifications of their affair and whether their countries will accept them. So as I mentioned, I'm leaving a bit out of this discussion, specifically the fuller significance and symbolism of the Bach piece that Henry plays. And in order to understand this, we must consider the last theme of the movie, which is probably my favorite, the most rich and complex, the most subtle and easy to overlook, and also the most closely linked to Henry. And that is the theme of animals and the hunt. So one might naturally think, wait, this movie isn't about animals, and ostensibly it is not. But in fact, animals are in some way present, either directly or indirectly, in almost every scene. All in all, I counted at least 15 different kinds of animals that either appear or are referred to in the movie. 3 of them appear live on screen, 9 appear in artworks, and 3 are alluded to either directly or implicitly. And almost all of them are closely linked to Henry. At least 11 of the 15 are in some way likened to Henry. And these different animals symbolize the different dimensions of Henry's personality, as well as the evolution of Alex and Henry's relationship, from passionate desire to love. Now I'll start off here by referring back to the one big exception to this pattern. And that is the only actually named animal in the movie, which is Henry's dog, David. So I discussed this back in the introductory video, the symbolism of David and his name, and the parallels that are set up between Alex and David, suggesting that Alex will ultimately take up the role of protector of Henry. And this connection of Alex to the dog is underscored in the hospital scene in the first act, when we see Alex putting on a puppet show, and he's holding dog and cat figures, and he ends the puppet show by smushing the two together and saying, "And then they became friends." This is clearly alluding to Alex and Henry, who are at this time just becoming friends, and it's fairly easy to decode the implied parallel here, as anyone can probably guess. Alex is a dog, and Henry is a cat. So Alex is clearly dog-like in his high energy, his openness and expressiveness, his playfulness, which sometimes even comes out in dog-like gestures, like in the lake scene. Also his extreme persistence in his political pursuits and in his pursuit of Henry, a quality that's also sometimes called doggedness. And also his disposition towards close emotional attachment. Now Henry, by comparison, is cat-like, graceful, poised, even aloof, also prone to forming emotional bonds, but more reserved in showing his feelings. Now beyond this dog and cat comparison, as the two men draw closer, Henry is gradually revealed to Alex, and by extension to us, through a series of animal metaphors. So just to begin with a simple one, firstly there are allusions to British national emblems, calling to mind Henry's role as a national symbol. So in the Instagram montage of scenes of London, we see a bronze lion statue. And then in the texting scene, when the two are teasing one another, Alex manipulates photos of Henry, and in one of them he covers over Henry's head with that of a unicorn. So the lion, for its part, again underscores Henry's feline nature and his strength, and even his hair and appearance can be seen as sort of leonine. And then the unicorn alludes to his elusiveness and mystery. And further, the lion and the unicorn are traditional heraldic symbols of England and Scotland, respectively. Hence why we customarily see a lion and a unicorn flanking the shield on the British royal coat of arms. Now next, probably the most obvious and visible symbolic animal linked to Henry is horses. So the connection to horses is first foreshadowed when Alex is forced to go to Kensington Palace, and when he arrives he meets Sean, the equerry, and Alex is curious about the meaning of this title, and Sean is rather evasive about exactly what his job and role entail. But Alex correctly observes that the title derives from the Latin equus for horse, and in fact an equerry originally referred to the keeper of a ruler or aristocrat's horses, and only later did it broaden to refer to a sort of general-purpose manager and assistant. Horses are traditionally symbols of status and power. There have even been many laws through the ages restricting who is allowed to ride a horse to those with noble or military status. They are also traditionally symbols of sexuality, and horseback riding is often used as a metaphor for sex. So after Henry and Alex first have sex in the White House, Henry then invites Alex to his polo match. And it's not surprising that when we see this match, the horses are really the stars of the scene. The camera focuses mainly on them, even more so than on the riders, and only gradually, as Alex watches the match, does the camera tilt up enough for us to get a clear view of Henry. Instead, we get many close-up views of the horses straining muscles and puffing breath, setting up an obvious foreshadowing and parallel to what Alex and Henry are about to do in the tack room. And this scene can be seen to represent Alex's discovery of Henry's body, of his animality, and his instinctive nature that has been hidden beneath his dignified persona, and that in turn excites Alex's instincts in response. And as we've seen, Alex learns about his own sexuality by observing Henry, both as an object of desire and as a model of how to appreciate the human body, especially the male body. The theme is then alluded to again much later in the confrontation scene in Henry's bedroom in Kensington Palace, when we see on Henry's wall a painting of two men, possibly polo players, side by side on horseback, mirroring and echoing the two lovers themselves. Now, to go back again to that texting scene, we also see Henry being attacked by a cartoon shark. And this introduces a recurring theme of Henry as a prey animal being hunted. On the one hand, by the outside world and the media. The images in this scene are taken from magazine photos, presumably snapped by paparazzi, who stalk, hunt, and prey upon Henry. And then also by Alex, who hunts and tries to capture Henry as a lover. So there are many clear allusions to the hunt woven throughout the movie. Alex, for one thing, is set up in parallel, as we said, to the dog David, who happens to be a beagle, and that is a hunting dog, a type of hound customarily used in hunting hares, incidentally like the dog that appears in Alice in Wonderland. As for Henry, as we learn, Henry's personal last name is Fox, and this is how he refers to his private self, as Henry Fox, and what, of course, is the iconic pastime of the British aristocracy, fox hunting. So this texting scene we've been talking about is followed then by the phone call scene, during which Alex has a turkey in a cage in his room. And there's humor and irony in this scene, in that he has the animal in a cage, yet he is still frightened of it. And this can be seen as a metaphor for his developing relationship with Henry, whom he wants to possess, and on some level already does possess through Henry's attraction to him, but whom he does not understand, and by whom he is still on some level intimidated. And it's significant that the turkey, too, is a prey animal, traditionally hunted for sport, and this is explicitly referred to in the book. So when Alex calls Henry and complains about this turkey and its frightening noises, Henry toys with him, claiming that he hunts turkeys in England and that he knows how to tame the turkey. But then we learn it's all a joke at Alex's expense. And this further underscores the metaphor that while Henry is in a sense captivated by Alex, he can still toy with him and outwit him. But thereafter, in more scenes, we see images alluding to the hunt, most often casting Alex in the role of a hunter pursuing Henry. For instance, on New Year's Eve, when Henry vanishes out into the winter night, Alex goes out to find him, and he tracks him by following his footsteps in the snow, in the manner of a hunter stalking prey. And he's able to find him also in part due to the full moon, which we see in the establishing shot shining over the party tent and the south grounds. And this establishes a pattern through the movie. The full moon is a traditional guide for hunters, and it's associated with classical deities of animals and the hunt, such as Artemis or Diana. And the full moon is later seen again over the Washington Monument during the scene where Alex and Henry first have sex, and then again in the final sequence in Austin, when, in a sense, Alex has finally caught his prey and is bringing it home. Now, in the book, the hunt is alluded to in a slightly different way. So in the New Year's Eve scene on the South Grounds, we are told that it is a clear night and there is moonlight. And when Alex catches up with Henry and asks what he is doing, Henry says that he is looking for Orion. And this is a constellation representing the cosmic hunter who hunted alongside and fell in love with the goddess Artemis, the patroness of animals and the hunt. So there will be further references to the hunt later in both the book and the film, but with shifting meanings. It can be taken to refer to and describe a kind of three-way love triangle between Alex, Henry, and the public. And initially, Alex and the public are both outsiders looking into Henry's world and misunderstanding him. So both, in a sense, are hunters in pursuit of and failing to capture Henry. But then this starts to change as Alex begins to enter into Henry's private world. Their relationship shifts, the intimacy grows, and Alex's goal shifts from hunting to instead taming Henry. For instance, in the karaoke scene in Austin, here Alex persuades Henry to come to his home turf in Texas. He then dresses him up in Western American-style clothes, including in Alex's Texas Longhorns cap. He then persuades Henry to perform on stage, which he does with a bull's head looming behind him. And he's sometimes seen with the bull horns coming right out of his head, being sort of animalized. And this alludes to Henry's sexual virility. The bull is often a symbol of male strength and sexuality. And also it refers to Henry's elusiveness. It can be seen to invoke the untamed, unbranded bull, the proverbial maverick, or more specifically, the bull that the cowboy attempts to ride in the rodeo. And during this whole scene, Alex is wearing a cowboy hat, completing the metaphor of bull and rider, or of the cowboy at the roundup trying to capture and brand the maverick bull. So this is clearly an important metaphor for Alex and Henry's relationship, since, as we saw earlier, this is the moment where Alex clearly recognizes that he is in love with Henry. Shortly after, Alex decides to tell Henry how he feels and try to lock down the relationship. But this does not go well. It leads to a rupture. And this too is foreshadowed and elucidated by another animal metaphor. So in the dock scene, where Alex is clearly building up to tell Henry that he loves him, we see the two men lying out on this floating dock. Their bodies are mostly bare. This is actually the most naked skin we see in the whole movie. And their poses and gestures are open, affectionate, playful. But if we look on Henry's swimming trunks, the pattern is of turtles. And the turtle is an animal that carries its armor around on its body, much like the armor that Henry says he wears. And the turtle withdraws into its shell when it is threatened. And as we see, this is exactly what Henry does in this very scene, when he turns away from Alex, plunges into the water, and swims away, and subsequently flees back to Britain and cuts off communication. So we see Henry in England, and he evidently feels abandoned. He complains about his mother being absent and unavailable to help in this crisis, and he remarks that she is off saving elephants in Botswana, and then jokes sardonically that perhaps I ought to grow a pair of tusks. So here he likens his own situation, being unable to form a real relationship for fear of being outed, to an animal who is threatened by poachers. So this is an early shift here, suggesting the idea now of the media or the public or the crown as predators, and Henry being a prey animal without a protector. Meanwhile, back in America, we see that Alex is lost and distraught. It seems there is little or nothing he can do to get through to Henry, and Nora tells Alex that according to Henry's friend Percy, Henry sometimes goes into his, quote, cocoon phases, and there's nothing to do but wait it out. This in turn alludes to another animal metaphor that has already been developed and is following Henry through the movie, and which subtly offers hope. So if we look back again to that hospital scene, we see Alex dressed up as a strawberry. Now, we never see Henry dress up in a costume, but when the two of them are introducing themselves to the kids, we do see two costumes set off to the sides of the room. We see Alex's strawberry suit, and then off at the other end, we see, presumably for Henry, a butterfly costume, which, as far as we see, he never wears. So there's a subtle reference here suggesting that Henry is in a kind of caterpillar stage, intended to be a butterfly, to take on that form, but he is not yet ready to do so. The metamorphosis is delayed. However, shortly after, when the two are texting one another, we see Alex mute Henry, and when he does so, Henry dissolves into a cloud of butterflies. And this suggests that Alex perceives the potential for transformation in Henry. And also, I would note that the butterflies are sort of golden orange colored and look like monarchs. It's not quite clear enough to tell for sure, but they look like monarch butterflies. So this is, for one thing, another royal reference. And considering the context, I would venture to say it's another hint that Henry will, in fact, eventually become king. But regardless, before that, he has to change in a way that will make him ready to, you could say, come out of his cocoon. Now, after Alex confers with Nora, he goes to Kensington Palace, and we find Henry holed up in bed in a long plush robe, almost like a cocoon. And this is the scene, of course, where Alex confronts Henry the most forcefully, invading his personal space and using every tactic he can to pull Henry out of his shell. And this can be seen as the final culmination of Alex's hunt, where he will either capture Henry or lose him. And during this scene, we see over Henry's bed a nautical painting. And specifically, it is J.M.W. Turner's painting, Whalers, which shows a chaotic scene with a huge whale struggling against a whaler's boat and a ship in the background, all of these figures shrouded in mist and foam kicked up by the enormous thrashing whale's tail. And this underscores the confusion and agitation of this scene, and it puts a sort of final note on the climax to Alex's pursuit of Henry. So subsequently, Henry seems to give in to Alex's emotional demands. He calmly leads Alex out to the museum, and then afterwards Henry sees Alex off at the airport. So we can see here he's starting to come back out of his shell, like the turtle or like the butterfly emerging from its cocoon. Now, after this point in the third act of the movie, the predator is now no longer Alex, but rather the press and the hostile public. And this shift in metaphor is subtle. In the book, again, it's alluded to somewhat more explicitly. So in the movie, Henry's and Alex's emails are hacked and published in the press. And we don't know why or how they were hacked, but it's strongly implied that the journalist Miguel Ramos had some hand in it. In the book, the character of Miguel does not exist. Rather, Ellen Claremont's political enemies, it seems, orchestrated the leak of the emails. But we still don't know for certain how they obtained the emails in the first place. And it is subtly implied, I think, that they were stolen by Alex's rival at the Texas campaign office, a young, spoiled, and privileged intern from Boston whose name is Hunter. So this is how the word actually appears in the book. In the movie, it doesn't come up explicitly, but we do see scenes of Henry being hounded like a prey animal until Alex steps in, first rhetorically and then literally to shield him. So here Alex's role shifts from being a predator to a protector, and you could say from a huntsman to a shepherd. So when the two lovers reunite on the stairs in Kensington Palace and Alex embraces Henry protectively, looming above them on the wall is a painting of a hunting scene, and more specifically, a fox hunt. So altogether, this composition dramatizes Alex's protection of Henry from these looming predators around him. And the metaphor of the shepherd is further driven home with a musical allusion. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when the two lovers reunite on the stairs, we begin to hear Henry play a piece by Bach, which is called in German Schafe können sicher weiden. And it happens that this song or aria comes from a longer cantata, a series or suite of songs that Bach composed in 1713 to celebrate the birthday of one of his patrons, Duke Christian, the ruler of a small state in Germany called Saxe-Weissenfels. And the title of this longer suite or cantata is Was mir behacht ist nur die muntre Jagd, or All that pleases me is the lively hunt. And it's also in English sometimes called the hunting cantata. So this series is naturally on the theme of the hunt, which is the traditional pursuit and pastime of the landed nobility and was a favorite sport of the Duke. It was first performed in the Duke's hunting lodge, or Jägerhof, and the suite involves singers playing the roles of various mythological characters, including Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and Pan, the spirit of the forest and the wilds. Most of the songs are accompanied by horns, which are associated with the hunt. And at the same time, it's a political piece. It was written for a ruler, and like a lot of traditional European art and literature, it uses the hunt as a metaphor for strong and capable rule. Hence, it alludes to Alex's and possibly Henry's aspirations towards wise, beneficent leadership. And the cantata, as it progresses, has a subtle message. The tone shifts, much like in the movie. It shifts from emphasis on the hunt, which can be seen to represent warlike and fearsome rulership, towards emphasis on shepherding, as representing peace and guardianship of the people. And the most famous song from the cantata, the one which we hear Henry playing, is the seventh, called Schafe können sicher weiden, or Sheep May Safely Graze. This song is sung by a soprano voice playing the role of Phallis, the patron god of shepherds, and it's accompanied not by horns but rather by softer recorders, a woodwind instrument evocative of shepherds' flutes. And I'll link in the description to a version that I like that's performed by a soprano voice with recorders and the organ. And the lyrics of this song in German are Schafe können sicher weiden, wo ein guter Hirte wacht. Wo Regenten wohl regieren, kann man Ruhe und Friede spüren, und was Länder glücklich macht. Or roughly in English, sheep may safely graze, where a good shepherd watches over them. Where rulers are ruling well, may we enjoy our peace and quiet, and all that makes a country happy. So it makes sense that we see Henry playing this song while Alex literally watches him with this sort of serene expression. And it conveys the sense of safety and security that Henry has in Alex's presence. But the invocation of this song also subtly establishes a link between, on the one hand, Alex's relationship with Henry, in which he acts as a protective and loving partner, and his political aspirations to serve as a beneficent leader of his country. And this then sets up the conclusion of the film, in which we see Alex support Henry in coming out, in which he sees his political efforts in Texas bear fruit and his mother reelected to leadership, and in which he celebrates this by finally bringing Henry back to his emotional base and center, his family house in Austin. So ultimately, I hope that all of this can serve to illustrate what I've been saying since I started making these videos and even before, which is that this is a movie of really exceptional complexity and depth that rewards close analysis much more than one might expect based on its image or its marketing. And I don't know how many, probably hundreds of hours I've spent making these videos over the past year, but it's been a labor of love. And I hope to keep going, and next at some point to talk about the politics of the movie, the political ideology that frames the story and how it's told. And this might be kind of a more spicy one, since I probably have a different perspective from a lot of other fans. I think that the politics are one of the weaker points of the movie, but they're really worth examining, and as I hope to say in the last part, one can take issue with the sort of political assumptions that might frame a piece of art like a movie, but at the same time appreciate and enjoy and learn from it as a piece of great art, which I think that this movie is. So please, if you want to see this series followed through to completion, please post about it, tell friends, family, frenemies, and especially if you can, click through to the Historiansplaining Patreon page. I'll have the link in the description, and support at any level you can. That's really my primary income now, and that's what's supporting this and making it possible to make this series. And thank you so much to my viewers and my patrons. Thank you to the musicians and websites who provided the music that's in this video. And finally, once again, thank you to Marco Cera for letting me use part of his version of Schafe können sicher weiden, Sheep May Safely Graze. Thank you.